They found her in the barn behind Silas Hartwell's farmhouse, barefoot in the snow, eyes wide open, not a single shiver on her body. It was January 15th, 1847, and the town of Milbrook, Massachusetts, was already buried beneath 2 feet of white silence. The doctor said it was a miracle she was alive, but those who saw her said something else. They said it wasn't a miracle. It was a warning. Her name was Latoya. She said nothing more. No last name, no history, no past, only a thin cotton dress and a brass locket pressed against her chest like a relic that whispered, not to be touched. The farmers who found her didn't speak of it publicly, but one of them, a young hand named Ephraim, went mad. 3 nights later, claimed he heard a voice speaking in an unknown tongue behind the walls of the barn. They found him clawing at the wood, muttering about eyes in the frost. When they brought Latoya to Blessed Mercy Infirmary, she didn't resist, didn't tremble, didn't even blink. The hospital chapel bell tolled once as she entered. Though no one had pulled the rope, Dr. Jonathan Aldrich, chief physician, wrote in his notes, "The patient shows no signs of exposure or trauma, but her presence carries a strange pressure in the air, as though the very walls were holding their breath." By nightfall, the furnace in the east wing failed. The candles burned low even when freshly replaced, and Sister Mary Catherine reported that the crucifix in the main hallway had fallen from its hook. None of these were treated as signs. Not yet. Just strange happenings in a cold winter. But something in her silence began to pull on the minds of the staff and the patients, as if memory itself became unstable in her presence. Time, they said, felt slower around her. Rooms dimmed even in daylight. Voices echoed longer than they should. The first night, Latoya whispered while she slept, not in English, not in Latin, but in something older, a sound that made. The nuns crossed themselves without understanding why, and in that moment, those who listened closely knew something ancient had returned. Dr. Aldrich did not believe in spirits. He believed in science, in anatomy, in reason. He had studied under the finest minds at Harvard. He had dissected brains, mapped nerves, classified disorders that lesser men still called possession. But nothing in his training prepared him for Latoya. On the second morning, he entered her room as sunlight slipped through the ice-covered windows. She was already sitting up, waiting for him, as if she had known the exact moment he would arrive. No greeting, no smile, just a steady gaze. Her eyes were not vacant. They were not confused. They were ancient. The kind of eyes you find carved into stone at forgotten temples. He asked her name again. She said nothing. He asked about her family. She looked at the wall as if something stood just behind it, listening. Then softly, she spoke, but not in English, not in any known tongue. Her voice lowered the air, like it thickened around them. And for the first time, Dr. Aldrich felt fear, not terror, not panic, but something deeper, a fear of the unknown, a fear that whispered, "You do not understand what you're touching." He called for Dr. Brennan, the youngest physician, a linguist trained in classical languages. When Brennan arrived, he listened carefully and grew pale. "This isn't Latin," he said. "It's a hybrid. Fragments of African tribal dialects, mixed with Caribbean root languages, possibly spiritual or ceremonial in nature, but fluent, as if it were her native tongue." They asked Latoya how she knew the language. She blinked slowly and said in perfect English, "I don't. I only speak English." That night, the hospital changed. The floorboards creaked in patterns. The chapel lights flickered during prayer, and every clock in the infirmary froze at exactly 3:17 a.m. Nurse Thornton, who had worked there 12 years, saw something in the mirror as she washed her hands, a shadow that didn't belong to her. She screamed and refused to return to the third floor. Dr. Aldrich wrote in his journal that night, "I do not believe in demons, but I can no longer say with certainty that they do not exist." The town of Milbrook did not speak of such things. It was a place of order, of prayer, of clean hands and cold hearts. The church bells rang on time, the sermons followed script, and when something didn't fit the rhythm of life, they buried it under silence. But now, whispers began to spread like frost through the town, first among the nurses, then the stable hands, then the shopkeepers who noticed that the doctor no longer made eye contact. Reverend Whitmore was seen pacing the cemetery grounds late at night, muttering scripture under his breath. His sermons took on a darker tone, warning of hidden sins, of ancient trespasses, of forces that wear human skin. Back at the infirmary, Latoya had not slept for 3 nights. She would lie awake, eyes open, staring into the ceiling beams, as if she saw constellations carved into the wood. She asked strange questions. Do you believe the dead remember the living? Do buildings remember pain? Have you ever seen time fold in on itself like cloth? The nurses avoided her room, but patients began to request to be moved closer. They claimed she made them dream one woman, half paralyzed from a stroke, woke in tears after a night beside Latoya's door. She said she had spoken with her dead mother, had smelled the bread she used to bake, had heard her voice again. Dr. Aldrich documented each case, but with a tremor in his pen. He no longer slept soundly. He found himself waking at 3:17 a.m. every night, the precise time the clocks had stopped, always to the sound of faint whispering coming from the hallway. But when he opened the door, silence. He requested an independent examination. A former student of his, Dr. Lydia Price, an alienist from Boston, arrived under the pretense of a psychiatric consult. But after 20 minutes with Latoya, she emerged pale, shaken, and refused to speak about what had happened. She left that night, leaving behind a note. Your patient is not insane, but she is not merely human either. She is a gate, and something has stepped through. The most puzzling aspect of her case emerged during the intake process, when asked about her religious background. Latoya's demeanor shifted instantly. Her hands began to tremble. Her pupils dilated. Her breathing turned shallow, and then she whispered something not in English, not in Latin, but in a language that halted every breath in the room. Dr. Marcus Brennan, the youngest physician and a former student of classical languages at Harvard, immediately stepped closer. His face drained of color. These words do not follow Latin grammar, he said slowly. They seem to be drawn from multiple root systems, fragments of ancient African Caribbean and even Phoenician dialects. But none entirely align. It was as if she was speaking from a linguistic root older than any known branch, a mother tongue that predated history and memory itself. When questioned, Latoya claimed ignorance. I only speak English, she said quietly, but her voice carried an accent no one could place. Not Southern, not island, not colonial. Something entirely foreign, and yet eerily familiar. That night, the hospital became uneasy. The nurses on duty reported odd behavior from the other patients, who began waking without cause. And speaking of strange dreams, one described standing in a forest of black trees, another said. She heard her mother singing a lullaby, her mother, who had died 30 years before. Sister Mary Catherine claimed she saw Latoya standing silently in the hallway long after lights out, staring at the crucifix above the chapel door, her lips moving in that same ancient whisper. By the end of her first day, Latoya had become a presence, not a patient, Dr. Aldrich noted in his journal. The staff speak of her in hushed tones, not because of fear, but reverence. or perhaps something deeper, something ancestral. A recognition buried in the blood of everyone who crosses her path. She is not mentally ill, not delusional, not possessed in the traditional sense. She is remembered by the body, even if the mind denies it. The other patients respond to her like children, to a fire. Fascinated, terrified, and drawn. And so the Blessed Mercy Infirmary began to change not through action, but through presence, not with force, but with stillness. She did not scream. She did not beg. She simply existed, and in doing so, the very structure of belief within those walls began to fracture 1 inch at a time. During her first night at Blessed Mercy, the air itself seemed to thicken, not with smoke or illness, but with attention, as if the hospital walls themselves were listening. Sister Mary Catherine noted in her journal that the crucifix above the infirmary door had tilted slightly, a detail that unsettled her more than she could explain. Latoya had not moved from her bed, and yet each time a nurse passed her door, they reported a sensation they could not articulate, a pressure behind the eyes, a memory they had never lived. The elderly patient in the next room, Mrs. Zelina Hitchcock, reported a dream that night, so vivid she awoke crying. She claimed Latoya had spoken to her in her sleep, recounting word for word the last conversation she had with her late husband 5 years ago. Details no one else could have known. When questioned, Latoya denied speaking to her, said she had been asleep herself, but Dr. Aldrich found Mrs. Hitchcock's account too precise to dismiss. That same night, the temperature in the eastern wing stabilized, despite failing furnaces and open drafts, and the rats that had plagued the lower pantry were found dead in a perfect circle beneath the chapel floorboards. Reverend Whitmore was notified, and he demanded a full exorcism of the infirmary. Scheduled for the following Sunday, the Reverend told Dr. Aldrich, "Whatever walks here is not of the devil, but something older, something outside the grasp of Scripture." Dr. Aldrich found himself caught between disciplines. Medicine demanded observation, religion demanded obedience. But what neither allowed was what Latoya represented: a third way. A living artifact of truths long buried under history, under doctrine, under fear. As he reviewed his notes from that first night, he realized that no known diagnosis fit her. She was neither delusional nor hysterical. She was centered, aware, listening to something no one else could hear. And as snow blanketed the silent town of Milbrook, Latoya stared from her window eyes, unblinking, into the darkness beyond the trees. And as she did, every shadow in the room seemed to lean toward her, waiting. By the 4th day, the other patients began reporting phenomena too consistent to ignore. Thomas Brewster, a sailor who had lost a leg to infection, began weeping during the night, claiming he'd seen visions of a coastline. He'd never visited a crescent-shaped beach where people danced around a fire singing in a language he somehow understood. He said the woman in the center of the circle had eyes like Latoya's, and when he awoke he could still smell the smoke on his bedsheets. Dr. Aldrich recorded the event with clinical restraint, but his journal revealed otherwise. The patient's description matches those of pre-colonial West African ritual sites documented in lost expedition notes from 1812. How could a man with no education and no exposure to anthropology describe them with such clarity, and why did he attribute them to her presence? Sister Mary Catherine, meanwhile, reported feeling watched when in Latoya's room, not by the girl herself, but by something behind her, as if the air rippled with consciousness. Latoya had not spoken more than 20 words since admission, yet her silence filled every corridor like a pulse. Dr. Brennan returned from Salem with historical records of a slave ship named the Espiranza, which wrecked off the Massachusetts coast in 1823. Among the manifest was a child named Latoya, aged approximately 4. The descriptions of her survival and behavior matched too closely to be coincidence. Survivors claimed she spoke to the dying in voices they recognized as their mothers, their ancestors, their gods. Could this be the same Latoya? The math didn't align. She should be nearly 30. And yet she looked no older than 21. When Dr. Brennan raised the topic during examination, Latoya simply smiled, a small knowing thing, and placed her hand over the locket she wore always without fail. She said softly, "I remember storms that came before I was born. I remember chains, but I also remember teeth in the dark and songs that turned bone into memory." And then she fell silent. Dr. Aldrich recorded a single line that night in his personal log. "If this is madness, then madness remembers something we forgot." The Blessed Mercy Infirmary had always stood as a monument to Christian rationalism, a fusion of piety and progress, built to treat the body and discipline the soul. But Latoya's arrival cracked that foundation, and something began to seep through in the weeks that followed. Her presence changed the rhythm of the hospital night. Watchmen began reporting time distortions. They would patrol the East Hall, only to emerge in the West Wing an hour later, without memory of crossing it. Clocks began to lose time, each by different increments. Patients claimed the days felt longer or shorter than they should have, and several insisted they'd lived moments before they happened. Nurse Thornton spoke of hearing her own thoughts, whispered back to her from empty rooms, always in Latoya's voice. A sense of collective disorientation settled over the staff. The more devout among them attributed this to demonic influence. But others, especially Dr. Brennan, began to suspect something more ancient at work. Not evil, but indifferent, a force that observed rather than acted, and whose awareness bent reality slightly each time it touched. One afternoon during prayer, a crucifix fell from the chapel wall, landing upright and unbroken at Latoya's feet, though she was nowhere near it. Sister Mary Catherine took this as a sign of spiritual balance, but Reverend Whitmore insisted it was a warning and began fasting in secret. Meanwhile, the town of Milbrook began whispering of the infirmary's strange atmosphere. Family members visiting loved ones reported feeling watched, not by people, but by the building itself, as if its architecture had taken on intent, more than one visitor claimed. The chapel smelled of salt water and ash. Despite being miles inland, Latoya remained quiet, but never passive. Her gaze unsettled even the most hardened staff, not because it was aggressive, but because it was too still, too deep, like looking down into a well that had no bottom, only echoes, and in those echoes, things began to wake. Dr. Aldrich finally decided to test the limits of Latoya's influence. He arranged a private observation chamber where patients could be brought to her one at a time under tightly controlled conditions. The first was Jeremiah Couch, an aging veteran who had not spoken in days and was believed to be near death. Within minutes of entering the room, Jeremiah opened his eyes and began recounting stories from the War of 1812, including names, dates, and tactical maneuvers that had never been recorded or shared with staff or family. Latoya said nothing throughout the session, but her eyes remained locked on the old man as he spoke. The words flowed from him like a trance. And when the session ended, Jeremiah asked for pen and paper to write letters to the men he believed were still alive, men who had died decades earlier when staff tried to correct him. He wept like a child, not for them, but for himself, because he remembered their deaths as if he had just watched them happen. The second patient, Timothy Wadsworth, was only 12, brought in by his parents. After fits of what they believed to be madness, he had spoken in tongues and described events far older than any child should know. When brought to Latoya, he stared at her for less than a minute, and then began to speak fluently, in the same unknown dialect she had used during her intake. The conversation lasted for nearly an hour, during which both remained perfectly calm. The boy described burial mounds beneath Milbrook groves, where women once summoned the wind and rivers that flowed backwards to mark sacred time. At the end he collapsed into sleep, and when he awoke he remembered none of it, but he was cured. The ministers now observing the case began to diverge. Reverend Marsh became convinced Latoya was a false prophet, while Reverend Blackwood believed her to be a vessel for spiritual memory, the embodiment of suffering passed down through blood and silence. Dr. Aldrich, meanwhile, found himself unable to sleep, plagued by dreams, not of her, but through her memories, that felt like smoke inside his lungs, memories that did not belong to him, and yet shaped him all the same. It was clear Latoya was not merely a case to be studied. She was a reckoning. The incident that changed everything came without warning and without logic. It was a Sunday afternoon, snow falling gently over the chapel roof, when Mrs. Hitchcock, who had been steadily declining, suddenly requested to speak to Dr. Aldrich alone. Her voice had grown weak, but her eyes were sharp-focused, almost fierce. She said Latoya had shown her things not just about her past, but about the very foundation of the hospital itself. She spoke of secrets buried beneath the infirmary, literal and metaphorical. She claimed that before the land was cleared, before the first brick was laid, the site had been sacred ground to the Panock people, a burial site, a place of convergence where memory was stored in earth, not text, where the dead were not gone but watching. And they were angry. She said Latoya carried those memories not like a book carries words, but like fire carries heat. She said the hospital had been built on top of unspoken guilt, and that Latoya was here not to haunt it, but to open it like a wound. When Reverend Whitmore heard the confession, he demanded that Latoya be isolated until further review, claiming the devil was using her as a mouthpiece for historical blasphemy. Dr. Aldrich resisted, but could not prevent the order from being enforced, and Latoya was moved to the locked ward at the top of the infirmary, alone with no visitors. That night the chapel doors opened by themselves, and the baptismal font cracked in half-spilling water that smelled of salt and iron. Nurses reported hearing drums beneath the floorboards. Not music, but rhythm, the kind that organizes the breath, the kind that predates speech. And from her room Latoya did not scream or cry. She simply whispered a single word over and over again in a language no one understood, but everyone felt. It was Sister Mary Catherine who broke the silence against orders. She brought a candle and a rosary and entered Latoya's chamber during the third night of isolation. She said she couldn't sleep, said the silence of the infirmary had grown too loud, that the absence of Latoya was louder than her presence ever was. She found the girl sitting in the corner, knees pulled to her chest, eyes wide open and unblinking, not afraid but aware, as if she had been waiting. "I came to pray with you," the sister said, but Latoya shook her head slowly and pointed to the floor beneath them. "Listen," she said, "you can hear them now. They've been waiting for someone to remember." Sister Mary Catherine reported that in that moment she felt the floor tremble, not violently, but rhythmically, as if something ancient and vast was shifting beneath them. She dropped to her knees, not from fear but recognition. "These are not demons," she said later. "They're memories shaped like spirits. They are the weight of what we buried, and Latoya is their voice." The next morning the sister resigned her post, turned in her habit, and left the convent, no explanation given, only a handwritten note left on Dr. Aldrich's desk that read, "I was wrong about the girl. She is not here to be healed. She is here to heal us. But healing always begins with pain." After Sister Mary Catherine left the hospital, a strange calm settled over the infirmary, but it was the kind of silence that comes before a storm. Staff reported fewer medical emergencies. Less pain, less struggle. Patients slept deeper and longer, but many began reporting shared dreams. They spoke of a woman walking through fire barefoot, her skin covered in ash, her eyes glowing like wet coal. They said she was showing them things, but not in words, in feelings, in scent, in sound, in memory. They dreamed of chains, but also of hands cutting them, of rooms underground filled with weeping, and of songs sung in languages older than the Bible, but somehow still familiar. Dr. Aldrich compiled these reports quietly, fearing the reaction from the ministers who had already begun urging the board to transfer Latoya to a mental institution in Boston. But Dr. Brennan made a decision that would change the course of everything. He took the locket from Latoya's belongings, the brass artifact with no markings, and brought it to the University Antiquities Department under the guise of academic curiosity. The results were disturbing. The metal was not brass. It was a unique alloy that predated modern metallurgy by centuries, and inside it were fragments of woven cloth interlaced with strands of what they identified as human hair. DNA analysis was not possible in 1847, but the scientists declared the artifact older than anything they had catalogued from the Americas. Dr. Brennan returned to the hospital pale and shaking. Clutching the artifact like a confession, he told Aldrich the object was not a keepsake, but a key. He believed it had been buried for generations and somehow found its way into Latoya's possession, not as an accident, but as destiny. She was not lost. He said she was placed. The ministers called for Latoya's exorcism, not as a ceremony, but as a last resort. Reverend Marsh had already begun gathering the necessary tools, blessed oil sacred texts, relics from the chapel vault. Reverend Whitmore agreed, though reluctantly, still shaken from his earlier encounter with the girl. Only Reverend Blackwood hesitated. His conscience unsettled, his dreams now filled with symbols he could not interpret. Dr. Aldrich refused to permit it, not under his roof, not under the name of medicine. He argued that what they were witnessing was not possession but memory, not pathology, but history demanding recognition. But he was overruled. The board voted 5-2. The exorcism would proceed the following Sunday, February 28th. Latoya was moved to the chapel, placed in the very center beneath the broken baptismal font. She made no protest, but her eyes remained closed, her hands folded. The ministers began the rite, reading from the Gospel of Mark, speaking in tongues of their own. But as they continued, a strange thing happened. The candles extinguished, not all at once, but in a sequence moving from left to right, as if something were walking past them. A cold wind swept through the chapel. Despite sealed windows, and the pews groaned as if under invisible weight, Reverend Marsh continued louder now, commanding the spirit to depart, naming the girl by full name, though she had never given one. And then she opened her mouth and spoke, but not in her dialect, in English, and what she said froze every man in that room. You do not command the past. You buried it. You forgot it. But I did not. The moment those words left her mouth, the chapel windows shattered inward, without impact. The relics on the altar fell and cracked. The ministers staggered back, one, vomiting, another, weeping uncontrollably. Latoya stood without help and walked to the door, pausing only to say, "I am not the one who needs cleansing." She returned to her room without assistance and locked the door behind her. For the next 3 days, she did not eat, did not drink. But the infirmary remained eerily stable. No deaths, no emergencies. The silence became unbearable. The staff avoided her wing altogether. Meanwhile, Dr. Aldrich began poring through Old Town records, desperate to understand what had been stirred up, the founding of Milbrook in 1692. The conflicts with native tribes, the slave routes through Massachusetts, forgotten by textbooks, but etched in shipping manifests and burial ledgers, discovered that the land beneath the infirmary had once been the site of an unsanctioned slave cemetery. Bodies buried without record, without markers, without prayer. He brought this discovery to the ministers, but they refused to believe it, declared the documents forged or misunderstood. But Reverend Blackwood said nothing, only left a note for Aldrich before resigning from the church entirely. She is not here to be cured. She is here to be witnessed. Latoya emerged from her room on March 3rd, no announcement, no ceremony, and walked directly to the infirmary library, a place she had never entered, before she pulled a single book from the shelf, an 1817 edition of New England spiritual folklore, opened it to a specific page, and left it on Dr. Aldrich's desk. The page detailed an oral history of a woman called the One Who Remembers. She had no fixed name, no birthplace, but was said to appear in generations, marked by blood and silence. Her role was not to punish, but to remind, not to heal, but to reveal. It was said that when she came, a place would either change forever or die. Dr. Aldrich could not explain how she knew of this text, or that the library even had a copy. He only knew that the dream he had that night was of a funeral and a birth happening at the same time, in the same room. The next morning, Latoya requested to see the patients one last time, not individually, but as a group. In the chapel, 7 were chosen, those who had responded most powerfully to her presence. And when they arrived, she spoke in the unknown language, but this time sang not a chant, not a hymn, but a song of layered voices, and they wept, not in fear, but in memory. Some fell to their knees. Others embraced strangers they could not name, and when the song ended, silence fell like a burial cloth, not dead but complete. She walked out of the chapel barefoot into the snow and disappeared from the record. The hospital officially recorded Latoya's case as closed, citing patient left of own accord file, incomplete. Aldrich never saw her again, but spent the rest of his career documenting phenomena that straddled the line between mind and soul. His journals became infamous among occult researchers and were later banned from publication by medical boards in Boston and New York. Reverend Whitmore left the ministry within a year, reportedly plagued by visions of a woman standing at the edge of every sermon, every prayer he offered, and Reverend Marsh died in a fire that consumed his study, leaving behind only a scorched Bible opened to the Book of Lamentations. Reverend Blackwood disappeared entirely, last seen boarding a ship to West Africa on what he called a pilgrimage of remembering. But the most profound change occurred within the hospital itself after Latoya's departure. The infirmary began to decay. Paint-peeled walls cracked. The furnace failed despite constant repairs, and within 2 years, the building was condemned and demolished, replaced by a textile warehouse that itself burned down in 1902. Locals claimed the land was cursed, but the town record simply removed it from maps, calling it inactive property. But patients who had been present during her time there reported lifelong changes. Dreams that persisted for decades, languages they could not translate, memories they never lived, but carried like scars. In the decades that followed, the story of Latoya became a whisper among medical students and priests alike. Some called her a prophet, others a trauma made flesh. Some believed she was an echo of history that found a body to inhabit. Others swore she was a spiritual contagion, not sent by heaven or hell, but something older. The attic where Dr. Aldrich's journals were found remained sealed by his family until 1961, when renovations uncovered them, along with the locket and a small cloth pouch containing 7 silver coins. These items are now stored in the Massachusetts Museum of Unexplained Phenomena. But the exhibits are rarely open to the public. No explanation has ever satisfied both science and faith. But this story persists, not because it was verified, but because it was buried, and things buried too long tend to rise. If you've made it this far, you're no longer just a viewer, you're a witness. Comment. I remember the forgotten. Below twice. If you feel something shifting inside you, something old, something nameless, this is not fiction. It is a fracture, and the deeper you go, the less you return as the man who entered. What happened in that hospital was not just about one woman. It was about memory, about justice, about the systems built on bones and denial, about the blood in the soil that whispers to those who can hear. The truth is not clean or linear or safe. It's buried in the places no one looks, in the words we don't translate, in the histories they erase from textbooks, but tattoo into land. And sometimes truth comes back, not with rage, but with remembrance. This story is not over because stories like this never end. They are cycles, not lines, echoes, not events. Latoya was not an anomaly. She was a message, and messages don't die. They wait. Somewhere a boy hears voices that aren't his own. A woman dreams in dialects she doesn't know. A building shakes at night without wind. The land remembers, and if you've heard this story, so do you. Subscribe only if you're ready for more, because what comes next is not safe, but it's real. And once you begin, there's no going back.